The road south of Kurobe Pass had been swallowed by rain for 3 days straight, and Kenji was carrying water from the stream when he saw her. She was kneeling beside the road, with both hands flat against the earth, as though the ground were the only thing keeping her upright. Her pack had been set down sideways, its contents half exposed. Small cloth bundles, a set of wooden containers sealed with wax, a roll of linen wrapping, and the rain had already darkened the outer fabric to black. She did not look up when he stopped. She was breathing in the careful, deliberate way of a person managing something they had not yet decided to admit. He set down his water bucket. The rain fell between them. She was young, 20, perhaps 22, that her hair was down from whatever arrangement it had been in and lay flat and heavy against her neck. The traveling coat was good quality, not merchant's clothing, but the kind a person invested in when they expected to spend long seasons on the road. Her hands, still pressed against the mud, were not soft. The knuckles were dry and cracked at the joints, the fingers stained along the cuticles with something dark that was not dirt. Kenji had spent enough time around field healers to recognize the residue of certain roots. He looked at her pack. He looked at the road ahead, which rose into the cedar forest and disappeared into gray mist within 40 paces. He did not ask if she was all right. She wasn't all right. The question would have been an insult to both of them. "There is a station house," he said. "It's on 400 paces up the road. It has been empty since last autumn." When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were glassy in a way that was not grief. It was fever, already at her for some time. Her jaw was set with the particular rigidity of someone who has decided not to acknowledge something they cannot afford to acknowledge. "I know it," she said. Her voice was hoarse but controlled. "I was planning to reach it before dark." He looked at the sky. The light had gone flat and gray, in the way that meant 2 hours until full dark, not 4. She knew this, too. He could see it from the way her eyes did not go to the sky when she said it. He picked up his water bucket and began walking. He did not look back. Behind him, after a pause of perhaps 15 seconds, he heard her pick up her pack and follow. The station house sat where the road bent around a granite outcropping, half hidden by cedar branches grown over its eaves. It had been a rest point for porters once. Now it was a building between purposes, its walls sound, but its interior stripped of everything useful. The hearth was intact. The roof held. The floor was bare dirt, packed hard by footsteps that were no longer there. Kenji opened the door and went inside. He set down his water bucket and began collecting what was there to work with. Rotting tatami that could be pulled apart for tinder, a length of rope hanging from a ceiling beam, 2 ceramic dishes with chipped rims, and a stack of cedar planks against the far wall left by someone who had meant to come back and had not. The girl came through the door and stood in the entrance, on her pack against her chest with both arms wrapped around it. Not how a person carried a pack when they were well. He crouched by the hearth and began building the fire without telling her to sit down. She sat eventually, with her back against the wall near the door. The cedar planks caught slowly with a lot of smoke. Then the smoke pulled up through the flue, and the flame settled into something real. The smell of cedar resin filled the room, sharp and clean and slightly medicinal. She sat with her arms around her pack and watched the fire. He filled one of the ceramic dishes from the water bucket and set it near the coals. He found the rope useful and the tatami mostly not. He spread his traveling mat on the floor between the hearth and the wall and sat down on it, cross-legged, and began working the leather wrapping on the hilt of his sword where the rain had softened it. The fire popped, and the rain moved across the roof in pulses. He had been doing this for long enough that he no longer noticed solitude as a condition. The particular quality of silence when no other person's breathing shares your air, sounds becoming more precise, absence becoming texture. He had lived inside it for years. Now there was breathing that was not his. Slightly irregular, with a catch at the top of the inhale, the kind that belonged to someone running a fever and working to conceal it from themselves. He glanced at her. Her eyes were closed, her head tipped back against the wall. She was not asleep. Her hands were still locked around her pack. The water in the dish was beginning to steam. He said nothing, so he continued working the leather. What he did not know yet, could not have known, was that she had been walking for 6 days. Her name was Rin, and she had left the town of Mishima the previous month with a commission from a physician named Ogata, who had trained her for 4 years and trusted her enough now to send her north alone. There was a village called Shiran in the Cedar Mountains, accessible only through Kurobe Pass, where a sickness had been taking the elderly and the very young. Ogata was too old to make the journey. Rin was not. She had spent 12 days in Shiran, examining patients, administering what she could, teaching the village's single midwife to prepare 2 decoctions that would need to be maintained through winter. When she left to return south, she had believed herself to be well. By the 3rd day, she knew she was not. She recognized the illness, had treated it in Shiran, had watched its progression with careful clinical attention. Fever building over 2 to 3 days. Deep cold that did not respond to warmth. Pain behind the eyes and at the base of the skull. It rarely killed healthy adults. It was not something you walked off, and she had been walking on it for 3 days because there was no alternative she could see that made sense. Now she was here, and the fire was burning, and her body had apparently decided that here was where it would stop pretending. She opened her pack carefully, methodically. Her hands shook slightly, which she noticed and set aside as a data point rather than a cause for alarm. Inside, the wooden containers, the cloth bundles, the linen wrapping. She found what she was looking for, a small sealed jar of powdered root, pale gray, that smelled like dry riverbed, and set it on her knee. She needed hot water. The dish near the coals would be steaming by now. She looked at the dish. It was on the man's side of the room. He was working on his sword's hilt, binding with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had learned to be useful to himself in all circumstances. Nothing about his posture suggested he was tracking her movements, but he was between her and the dish. She considered this for a moment, then decided the consideration was foolish, and stood up. Standing was more difficult than sitting down had been. The room moved sideways, in the way that meant the fever had climbed during the hour she had been sitting still. She held the jar and waited for the room to settle, then crossed to the hearth and crouched down and reached for the dish. He had already added a ceramic cup beside the dish, presumably from his own pack, and it was full of steaming water. She looked at the cup. He was still working on his hilt, binding, and hadn't looked up. She lifted the cup with both hands, steadied herself, and returned to her side of the room. She began measuring the powder into the water with the carved wooden spoon from her outer pocket, counting under her breath. 1 measure, 2. The water changing color slowly as the powder dissolved. The rain intensified on the roof. Outside, somewhere in the cedar branches, the weight of collected water released all at once and fell with a sound like a second rain, briefer and more specific than the first. She drank the preparation in careful sips, tasting it the way she tasted all medicine, noting the bitterness, the underlying astringency, the faint sweetness that meant the root had been dried correctly. It was good. She set the empty cup beside her and waited for it to work. The man by the fire had a face revised by weather and time into something no longer young but not yet old, with a specific stillness of features that had learned not to broadcast their owner's interior. His sword was worn the way of someone who had used it often enough that the wear was simply part of the object's nature. He was not guarding her. He was simply in the same room, which was a different thing. She closed her eyes and let the medicine begin its work, and listen to the rain. She woke once in the night to find the fire rebuilt, and a second mat placed near her, close enough that its edge touched hers. On the mat was a folded blanket from a pack not her own. Fever still present, slightly lower than before, head pain beginning to soften at the edges. She was thirsty. Beside the mat was the ceramic cup, full of water still slightly warm. She drank it without sitting up. She pulled the blanket over herself and went back to sleep. He was gone when she woke in the morning. Then the door opened, and he came in carrying water and a bundle of something wrapped in his headcloth, and the room smelled of cedar and rain-washed stone and the green smell of wet forest that has been standing in water for 3 days. She sat up. The fever was lower. Not gone, but lower, enough that the room was stationary when she moved, and the pain behind her eyes had retreated from acute to manageable. She was intensely hungry. He unwrapped the bundle, pine mushrooms, the large flat kind that grew at the base of cedar trees after heavy rain, and a handful of cattail roots still trailing mud from the stream bank. He began slicing the mushrooms with his small cooking knife, set a shallow clay pot over the coals, and began heating water. She watched him work. There was nothing ceremonial about it. He was not cooking for her. He was cooking, and she happened to be in the same room. He did not look to see if she was watching. He scraped the mushrooms into the heating water and broke the cattail roots with his hands. She reached for her pack and brought a small cloth bundle to the fire, so unrolling it across from him, dried herbs in labeled paper packets. She found the one she wanted, flat-leafed parsley, brought for medicinal purposes but useful here, and added a measured pinch without asking. He looked at the pot and did not object. She added a second thing, dried mushroom powder she had ground herself, which would deepen the broth in a way the single ingredient could not achieve alone. She folded the packet and returned it to the bundle. The broth began to smell like something. They ate from the 2 chipped ceramic dishes, both crouching by the fire, in silence. It was not the silence of 2 people who do not know each other. It was the silence of 2 people who have been in a room together long enough that speech would require a reason. The rain outside had dropped to a fine mist. The cedar branches against the roof had stopped dripping. Through the single small window, the sky showed the pale washed-out gray that sometimes, in mountain weather, preceded clearing. She washed both dishes at the water bucket, using sand from the corner of the room as an abrasive, and set them to dry on the edge of the hearth. She returned to her side of the room and took inventory of her pack, assessing what had been used and what could be replaced from forest resources if she had time before the road cleared. He was sharpening a small tool at the other side of the room, and the sound of stone on metal came at measured intervals, like a slow clock. "How long has the pass been closed?" she said. "The road south washed out 2 days ago. The water will drop in another day, possibly 2. She calculated. Supplies for 3 days careful, 4 if she rationed. The fever would cost at least 2 days of movement. She would arrive in Mishima late. "The village north of the pass," he said after a pause. "Sharon." "Yes. I heard there was sickness there." "There was. There will be less of it by spring." He turned the tool in his hand. "You went alone." "Ogata is 63. The journey would have been difficult for him." "And not for you." "I did not account for becoming ill on the return," she said without shame. An error in assessment was an error in assessment. He returned to sharpening. The day passed in this way. She slept twice, both times waking to find the fire maintained at the same temperature, which required more attention than it appeared to. She worked on her records during the waking hours, 12 days of observations from Sharon that needed organizing into something Ogata could use. Her handwriting was worse than usual, but the notation system did not require beautiful handwriting to be legible. He had made a second fire-building frame from the cedar planks by evening, which she had not asked him to do, but which meant maintaining the fire overnight would be significantly easier. He did not explain why he had built it. It was simply there, fitted together with joinery that required either practice or an eye for how things worked. She looked at it for a while and decided it was probably both. The second night, she slept more solidly than the first. When she woke before dawn, needing water, the fire was burning at the same careful temperature, warmer than the available fuel should have made it, which meant he had managed it through the night. He was asleep on his mat, on his back, with one arm beside him and one across his chest, in the posture of someone who has trained themselves to sleep lightly. She filled her cup from the water bucket and drank it and looked at the fire and then looked at him. She had treated a great many people in 4 years. Ogata had taught her to observe without inference, to see what was there rather than what she expected. She applied it now to the man asleep across the room. What she knew, he was a Ronin, or had been, the sword too well kept and too worn to be decorative. His body integrated with it in the way of long practice. He was traveling south. Fuhai had rebuilt her fire without waking her, given her his blanket, prepared food for 2 without making it a gesture, built a fire frame from scrap wood. He had not asked her a single question she did not want to answer. What she was constructing, she was ill, which made her perceptions unreliable. She was also less alone than she had been in some time, and the not-aloneness had a particular quality she was not accustomed to. The fire maintained through the night by someone who had no obligation and had not established one. She returned to her mat and lay down and looked at the ceiling until the first gray light came through the window, and then she slept again. The fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day. She knew it before she was fully awake from the quality of her own sweat, the specific damp, a cooling release of a fever ending rather than the static clamminess of a fever holding. She lay still and ran a careful assessment. Head pain significantly reduced, approaching absent. Breathing unrestricted. Heart rate normal. The deep cold that had been sitting behind her ribs since the beginning had loosened. She sat up. She was hungry in a normal way, the way that belonged to a body recovering rather than a body trying to maintain function under duress. The fire was going. He was not in the room. Outside, through the window, the sky was the pale, clear blue that follows long mountain rain, and the light coming through the cedars had the specific quality of light, filtered through branches that are not moving, which meant the wind had dropped. The road south would be passable within a day. She stood up without difficulty and went to the door and opened it. The morning air was cold and sharp with pine resin and the smell of wet stone, and the cedar forest around the station house was dripping slowly, releasing the rain it had collected over 3 days in patient small increments. The road was still mud, but she could see where it firmed up 10 paces from the door. She walked to the edge of the road and stood in the morning air and breathed it, which she had not been able to do without discomfort in 3 days. It tasted like the end of being ill, which was one of the better tastes she knew. He came back up the road with his water bucket. He looked at her standing in the road, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that did not require translation, the recognition that the condition of things had changed. She said, "The fever broke." He looked at her for a moment. "Good," he said, which was the entirety of what he said, and which was enough. They ate the last of the pine mushrooms for the morning meal, along with dried fish he produced from the bottom of his pack, and she added a preparation of dried ginger and 2 other herbs to the water that improved it significantly, and they sat across the fire from each other and ate without ceremony. She had been thinking about what to say since the pre-dawn hours. She had arrived at the conclusion that the standard forms, gratitude expressed formally, obligation acknowledged, and promise to be repaid, were not equal to what had occurred over the past 3 days, and that attempting them would produce something smaller than the thing itself. He had seen her in a condition she could not have managed alone, and he had managed it alongside her without making it a transaction or a performance. He had not required anything from her in return, not conversation, not the performance of gratitude, not the diminishment of herself that would have been required if she had needed to ask for what she was given. She had remained, throughout, herself, her competence intact, her dignity intact, her privacy intact. He had not saved her. He had simply been there, which was an entirely different thing. She was not sure she had words for this that would not make it less than it was. She said, "I will reach Mishima in 2 days if the road holds." He was looking at the fire. He nodded. "Ogata will want to know the conditions on the road through Kurobe. If you are continuing south, I can tell him you were on it." It was an invitation without being an invitation. She did not take it back. He was quiet for a while. The fire settled. Outside, the cedar branches finally released the last of their held water in a long cascade that sounded, briefly, like rain starting again. "I'm going as far as the coast," he said. "After the coast, I have not decided." The coast was east of Mishima by 2 days' walk. Not the same direction, not a different direction. "There is a woman in Mishima named Sato who keeps a guest house on the south road," she said. "She charges fairly and does not ask questions." He looked at the fire. Then he looked at her, a direct look, the kind that required reciprocation. She met it. "See, I know it," he said. The road south opened on the afternoon of the 3rd day, and they walked out of the cedar forest with an hour of daylight left. The pass road descended in long curves toward the valley floor. The sky above the cedar line was fully clear, the deep saturated blue of mountain sky after rain, and the late light turned the wet cedar trunks, amber and the mud of the road, to something that looked, briefly, like polished stone. She walked well. The recovery was not complete, but the competence was back, the specific calibration of muscle and breath the fever had disrupted. He walked slightly behind her on the narrow sections and alongside her on the wider ones, and neither commented on this arrangement. They passed a marker stone at the first bend, and she stopped to read it out of habit. He waited. Ogata taught me to read these," she said. "He said a physician who does not know how far she is from the next town is a physician who will sometimes be in the wrong town." He looked at the marker stone. "He sounds like someone who thinks carefully about consequences." "Yes," she said. "He taught me to do the same." The road curved and the cedar forest gave way to mixed pine, and the valley came into view, the river silver in the late light, farming terraces cut into the hillside like steps, a cluster of buildings at the river bend that was the first village before Mishima. She thought about the past 3 days. She had been in need, which she did not like. She had been cared for, which she was not accustomed to. When she had been seen, not the version of herself she presented to patients and to Ogata and to the villages she moved through, but the version that had knelt in the rain with her hands flat on the ground. And she had not been diminished by it. She had not known until it happened how much it would matter. The road widened, and they walked side by side through the last of the pine forest. The smell changed from alpine resin to damp leaf and river water and distant wood smoke from the village ahead. She did not say what she was thinking. He did not ask her to. What she was thinking was that there are some debts that cannot be named without being made smaller, and the correct response is to carry them forward, not as obligation, but as the knowledge of what a person is capable of, which changes how you understand what the world can hold. The village lights came on as they reached the valley floor. The river made its sound alongside the road, moving water over stone, still running fast from the rain. He stopped at the junction where the road split. south toward Mishima, east toward the coast. She stopped beside him. They stood in the last of the light, and the wind off the river was cold and smelled of pine and the mineral smell of moving water, and neither spoke for a time that was long enough to be deliberate. "The guest house is on the left side of the south road," she said, "past the dyer's shop. There's a sign with a plum blossom that is mostly faded." He looked at the south road descending toward the river crossing and the lights of Mishima beyond. "Ogata's practice is on the east side of the main street," she said. "If you come through in winter, the light will be on before dawn." He was quiet. Then, without looking at her, "How did you know which road I would take?" She considered this. The honest answer was that she did not know. She had stated it as fact when it was only something she held as a possibility, which was the kind of imprecision she did not usually allow herself. "I didn't," she said. He looked at her then, and she looked at him. And the last daylight was the thin gold of last light over mountains, lying across the junction and the river behind it, and the village fires were coming on in the east. She adjusted the strap of her pack and turned south. She did not look back. She walked the way she always walked, steady, or purposeful, and the sound of the river accompanied her down the south road and across the bridge and into the outskirts of the town. He stood at the junction for a long time after she had gone. He looked at the south road. He looked at the east road. He looked at the sky, which had deepened to the dark blue of true evening, with the first stars beginning to appear above the cedar line in the west. The wind off the river moved through the pine trees along the road with a sound, like something being slowly decided. He had not told her his name. She had not told him hers. This had not been an oversight. What he thought about, standing at the junction in the dark, was something she had said on the morning of the second day when her fever had begun to drop. She had been counting, measures, preparations, and had said under her breath, "That was enough." He had not known what she was counting. He thought about it now. He looked at the south road. The lights of Mishima were visible between the trees, small, steady lights, the kind that belonged to a town that went to bed early and rose before dawn, and moved through its days in the rhythms that towns and valleys moved through. He picked up his pack and his water bucket, and he walked south. The road held firm under the night sky, and the cedar forest opened behind him, and ahead the lights of Mishima came steadily closer in the dark. The mountains he had come from rose behind him, white and clear and enormous in the night, their peaks catching the last of what light remained in the sky, holding it for a moment longer than the valley below could manage. Would you have kept walking south or turned east at the junction? And what would your choice have cost you?